Hello everybody, we are Group 5 and today we talk about inflation in Venezuela. So first, I will introduce about my group. There are 4 members and first time we talk about the overview about inflation. The second one is the data analysis. The third is solution and the last one is conclusion. So inflation is a quantitative measures of the rate at which the average price level of a basket of selected goods and services in an economy increase over some periods of time. It is the price in the general level of price, where a unit of currency effectively buy less than it did in prior periods. And then I have an example of inflation. So we have the cost of inflation. The first is demand pull effect. Demand pull inflation occurs when the overall demand for goods and services in an economy increase more rapidly than the economy's production capacity. And next is cost push effect. Cost push inflation is a result of the increase in the prices of productions with process inputs. And the third one is built-in inflation. Built-in inflation is the third cost that linked to adapted expectation as the price of goods and services rise, laborers expect and demand more costs to maintain their cost of living. This increased wage result in higher cost of goods and services, and this wage price spiral continues as one factor induces the other and vice versa.
Hello, I'm Young, and today I will talk about some pros and cons of inflection. So we start. Okay, um, there are several advantages of inflection. First of all, moderate inflection enables adjustment of wages. It is argued that a moderate rate of inflection makes it easier to adjust relative wages. Secondly, inflation can boost growth. At time of very low inflation rates, um, the economy may be stuck in a recession. Um, Targeting a higher inflation rate can enable a boost in economic growth. This view is quite controversial. I mean, not all economists would support targeting a higher rate of inflation. If the economy was stuck in a prolonged recession, some would target higher inflation. For, for example, the Eurozone has had a very low inflation rate in 2013 to 2014, and this has corresponded to very quick economic growth and very high unemployment. Um, if the ECB has been willing to target higher inflation, then we would have seen a rise in the Eurozone GDP. Lastly, inflation is better than deflection. The only thing worse than inflection was deflection. A fall in prices can cause an increase in the real debt burden and discourage spending and investment. Deflation was a factor in the Great Depression in 1930s. Okay, on the other hand, inflation might negatively cause some problems to the economy. For one thing, inflation tends to be unsustainable, leading to damaging period of boom and bust economic cycles. For example, in the UK, saw a high inflation in the 1980s, but this economic boom was unsustainable. And when the government tried to reduce inflation, it led to a recession from 1990 to 1992. Additionally, inflation can uh, discourage investment and long-term economic growth. This is probably because the uncertainty and confusion that is more likely to occur during periods of high inflation. Low inflation is said to encourage greater stability and encourage firms to take risks and invest. Last but not least, reduce the value of savings. Inflation leads to the fall in the value of money. This makes saver worsen. If inflation is higher than the interest rate, higher inflation can lead to redistribution of income in society. Often it is pensioners who lose out most from inflation. This is particularly a problem of inflation is high and interest rates is low. Okay, that's just for some advantages and disadvantages of inflation. Thank you for listening.
Okay, you just did a really good job at overview about inflation. After all, it is my turn to actually analyze the data. First of all, I want to talk about the reasons and how the inflation affects the economy right over here. Okay, let's take a dip into what is how inflation affects the economy and how it's reborn. Uh, let's take a look about recent inflation rates of Venezuela recently. First of all, let's in the late 20 and 21 century, Venezuela did fully controls about the inflation rate is roughly about 30% after all. But from 2016 to nowadays, the inflation rate skyrocketed to about over 6,000% in 2019. To describe how serious in this situation becomes that affects citizens in Venezuela, let me take a small example of this. After all, a grocery store that sells an apples for roughly about 20 bolivias, which is Venezuela in currency, on the first January of 2019, but till the end of the years, it cost over 13,000 Bolivia, which means that the price skyrocketed, right? So every people who go to the market that have to bring a fully suitcase full of money to actually only buy for food. In these situations, we call hyperinflation. Typically, where the inflation rate exceeds 50%. Let's see how it affects the Venezuela economy. First of all, is GDP. You know, everybody knows that GDP affects a lot on the GDP, right? The following chart illustrates the GDP of Venezuela. It's clearly recognized that the effects of hyperinflation in GDP. So during the period of 3 years, from 2006 and till today, or it's probably 5 years till today, the overall GDP is nearly reduced by half. In this graph, it illustrates that. It is clear that GDP of a country That is the one of the main indicators used to measure the performance of a country. When GDP growth is very low, that the economy probably must go down. So the opposite applies for workers, just like worker may re retrench, actually retrench and or pay a lower salaries and wages. Uh, Also, firms are reluctant to invest. So let's take another graph about the buying powers of Venezuela. This chart shows calculations of buying power equivalent for $100 from 1980. For example, if you start with $100 in 1980, so it could end in 2020 is about roughly 20 billion dollars in 2020. So in order to adjust the inflation rate, sometimes it's referred to a bidding inflation. It's obvious that nowadays Venezuela, Bolivia, which mean I have mentioned above that it is the currency of Venezuela, have no value at all in the world, even though its inflation is so high. So it's have no value compared to just like dollars. So the world trade market is affect a lot about the world trade market because Venezuela government always keep printing money, which cause the hyperinflation situations. Now let's talk about the main reason why Venezuela have such a high inflation rate. The hyperinflation rate in Venezuela have a steady, fairly standard cases because Venezuela owns the rest of the world, which own the rest of the world more than $50 billion. If it's own $50 billion in Bolivia, it's good no problem at all because government just print money. But unfortunately, Venezuela is debt about the dollars. This is a dollar debt. So Venezuela cannot create dollars at all. Venezuela cannot create dollars. So when the price and also when the price oil was high, it was able to earn the needed dollar to pay the debt. But however, when the price of oil was dropped, it could no longer earn enough money to pay for that debt, right? Because Venezuela is famous for selling oils. So the main economy depends on oil. Consequently, it had to create Bolivia to buy dollars from foreign exchange market in order to pay Venezuela debt. But otherwise, when government always keep printing money, this makes Bolivia dollars lose value on the foreign exchange market, which means inflation in the world. Because no one needs that many Bolivians. No one needs in the world, no one needs that much Bolivia. So it had no effect on the Venezuela debt at all because the debt is not Bolivia debt, right? Hence, the Bolivia inflation has become Bolivia hyperinflation. Hyperinflation has been a typical problem for Venezuela because its country depends on food imports. So they just import a lot of food because they cannot produce that much food, right? But when Venezuela money is have no value at all, so no food provider that can sell the food because they don't need Bolivia money at all. So the one possible solution in this case is that could strategically reduce the imports to increase the domestic product, particularly of food, and to raise domestic taxes on landowner, including the government itself. The government should not always print money at all, but this isn't something that can be done quickly. We need to spend many times, and government should adjust their choices to balance the economic. It will interesting to see whether Venezuela government can solve these problems. This problem nowadays is also the main concern for Bolivia government to today. So it seems like they're not having a good solution yet. But let's see in the future how can the government solve the problems.
Possible solution for hyperinflation. Immediate solution. The measure applied with the aim of immediately reducing the inflation fever on the basis of which measure of long-term monetary stability will be applied. These measures usually apply when an economy falls into a state of hyperinflation. The first is monetary easing policies. When inflation rates soar, the central bank immediately stops measures that could lead to an increase in the money supply, such as cessation of the counting and recounting of credit institution and cessation of paying short-term security on the money market, not issuing money to offset purchase deficit. The state apply measures to reduce the amount of money supply in the economy, such as central banks sell short-term security in money market, sell foreign currency and borrow, issue government debt instrument to borrow money in the economy to compensate for state purchase deficit, and redeposit interest rates, especially increase interest rates on residential savings deposit. The next is implementing the policies of tightening finance, cut unnecessary spend in the economy, balance the budget and cut spending as much as possible. For example, reducing government consumer demand, reducing increased demand or limiting wage increase, reducing the demand for spending of population. And the third is borrowing and applying for foreign aid. And the final is monetary reform. This is the last measure when the opposed measures have not yet brought the desired effect. Now we move to the long-term solution. Along with the situation measure, countries also use the strategic measure to affect the long-term development of the economy and make the monetary base stable and sustainable. The first is stimulating economic growth. If economic growth is consistent with the role of money supply, inflation may not occur when the other factors are also in balance. Second, promote the development of good production and expand good circulation. This is the third strategic solution to control inflation and maintain monetary stability in nation economy. The more domestic production develop, the more solid premise for monetary stability is.
So I will talk about the inclusion, and if inflation takes place in a country in a long time, it has a negative impact on its economic, politics, and social problems, especially interest rate, and therefore in hyperinflation, in order to make the interest rate stability, effective rate must increase, which is one of the main reasons leading to unemployment and economic depression. However, economists can risk benefit from inflation in case the rate of inflation is between 2% and 5% with developed countries and below 10% with developing countries, because it not only stimulates consumption, borrowing debt, and investing in reducing unemployment in society, but also allows the governments to
have more options to stimulate investments in less favored fields through credit expansion and to redistribute income and resources in society. However, it's a difficult and risky job. If not, actually, it will cause bad consequences. In fact, operating a country, most governments decide to make their economy have high economic growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. However, in reality, low inflation rate and an upward economic growth is never possible. Nevertheless, low inflation rate means slow economic growth. Whenever money is in excess, there is buying by consumer due to which the cost of goods escalates. Therefore, in order to have a thriving economy, it requires an extremely smart policy and a talented government who's proficient in taking advantage of both macroeconomic knowledge and public administration tools. And that's on that my group wants to share with you. Thanks for your attention.